All right, so we were going to wrap up here with our last panel. Brownson's challenge to American Catholics. So we've heard some of the framework and the Brownson's ideas on church and state. That he was happy that there is this harmony, but it also presents American Catholics with a challenge to live up to his expectation that Catholics can really play a role in maintaining our republic. So to address this, we have first Michael Federici is a professor at the Middle Tennessee State University. He's also the editor of Orestes Brownson's Catholic Thought. And then I'll go to Kevin Vance, who is the director of the Center of Constitutional Liberty at Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas. Most recently, he has been a postdoctoral fellow and visiting professor at Clemson University in the Department of Political Science and the Lyceum program. And prior to that, Forbes postdoctoral research associate at the James Madison program at Princeton University. So let's hear from Brownson's challenge to American Catholics.
Thank you, Tom, for your kind invitation to come back to the Catholic University, which was so instrumental in my intellectual formation. I am delighted to be back on campus, and I am delighted to have had the opportunity to meet President Kilpatrick, who is coming to my neck of the woods next month to Nashville, Tennessee. And I'm going to frame my comments by responding to a question that Justin Litke asked on the previous panel regarding Aristotelian moderation. Just going to broadly put Brownson on a continuum because that's what Professor Litke wants. The one group of Christians that have not been mentioned yet during this conference, at least not to my knowledge, are the Benedict option people. And I would put them at an Aristotelian extreme retreat. It may be a strategic retreat, but it's a retreat nonetheless. And they're at the opposite end of a continuum from the integralists who don't just want to engage, they want to take over. And I would argue conflate church and state, things of God and things of Caesar. And Brownson falls in between these two extremes, closer to the Aristotelian middle. So with that in mind, my formal comments. Insightful thinkers and philosophers from past ages are like prophets. They remind us of forgotten truths, and they suggest ways that those old truths can be applied to new historical circumstances. In some cases, they reconstitute old truths in a Burkean way that is only possible in new, original circumstances. In Orestes Brownson's case, he applied old truths of the Catholic tradition to the new American Republic. And in doing so, he reconstituted the American political tradition. He embraced the American framers' constitutional system while reconciling it with the Roman Catholic tradition at a time when many Americans, following the example of Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine, argued that the papacy in particular and the Catholic faith in general were inconsistent with Republican government. Brownson provided a forceful response to those who considered the church's hierarchy antithetical to democracy. It has taken time, but it is widely accepted that Brownson was correct when he argued for the compatibility of Catholic Christianity and democracy. What is unclear is the extent to which American Catholics reshaped their faith to fit into a democratic and largely Protestant culture, and in doing so, lost sight of the aristocratic and morally ennobling aspects of the faith that Brownson considered essential to its success. The tendency of some contemporary American Catholics is to embrace nationalistic populism. The tendency of some contemporary American Catholics to embrace nationalistic populism is an indication that the Democratic tail may be wagging the Catholic dog. The result of Brownson's melding of traditions is a political theory that is difficult to reconcile with populism, an ideology that was in its infancy in his day and that Brownson embraced around the time of the 1840 presidential election and rejected soon thereafter when he converted to Catholicism. His religious conversion to the Catholic faith inspired a political conversion to constitutional republicanism that illustrates the symbiosis of faith and politics that is at the heart of Brownson's political theory. In regard to Brownson's conversion, the dog wagged the tail. When Brownson's political theory is viewed in this light, it serves as a reminder that the American Constitution and the Catholic faith are not suited for a populist style of politics or an integralist regime. Populism subordinates the church and divine will to popular will. Integralism conflates the church and the state. The framers' constitutional republic, animated by an authentically Catholic culture, was, for Brownson, the ideal political order for the United States. While I will focus on the incompatibility of populism and Brownson's political theory, I will address briefly the possibility that Brownson overestimated the influence of Catholicism on American political culture and underestimated the extent to which American Catholics would be Protestantized. That is, they remained nominally Catholic, but were spiritually Protestant. I will also argue in opposition to Patrick Deneen that Brownson correctly identified the compatibility of the American constitutional tradition and the Catholic tradition. Whatever liberal characteristics are part of the framers' political theory, their overarching philosophical anthropology is sufficiently consistent with classical and Judeo-Christian insights to support Brownson's proposition that the two can be reconciled. My presentation will highlight three interrelated reasons why Brownson's political theory is difficult to reconcile with populism. 1. Populism is grounded in a view of human nature that is at odds with both the American framers' conception of human nature as well as that of the Catholic tradition. In short, populism assumes the natural goodness of the common people and the inherent corruption of elites. It is much closer to Rousseau and Marx than Augustine and Publius. 2. American political institutions reflect the moral dualism of the classical and Judeo-Christian tradition. They aim to limit, divide, check, and decentralize power. Populism, by contrast, centralizes power in the hands of a great leader who embodies the will of the people and substitutes fidelity to the momentary popular will, often the rhetorical pretense for following the populist leader's will, for fidelity to the Constitution and the rule of law. 3. The core of Brownson's political theory is that the American political system requires a spiritual foundation that stems from the Catholic faith and its philosophical anthropology. The unchecked will of the people needs to be governed in both moral and political life. It is incapable of serving as the moral or political authority. While the written Constitution provides institutions that check and restrain human will and appetite, the Catholic Church is part of the unwritten or what Brownson called the providential constitution, that morally prepares citizens for life in the republic. It is in the space of political culture that Catholicism competes not only with Protestantism, but also with an array of progressive and naturalistic ideologies that undermine the philosophical realism that gave life to the American constitutional order. The Church has not been immune from social justice humanitarianism that replaces the moral realism of the framers, that Brownson found compatible with the Catholic tradition. His dividing line may have been misplaced. Rather than separating Catholics and Protestants, it should have separated Christian and classical humanists from humanitarians. In Federalist 51, James Madison concisely articulates the relationship between human nature and government in an Augustinian way. There he asserts that government is the greatest of all reflections on human nature. Had men the nature of angels, no government would be necessary. Likewise, were men governed by angels, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. Yet, the moral purity of angels is not the stuff of human nature or of politics. Governments are comprised of men who govern men. Thus, Madison concludes that in framing a government, you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. Populists are keen to note that in considering the need for government to be controlled, Madison identifies the primary control on government to be the people. Likewise, in Federalist 10, Madison acknowledges the possibility that the people will know the public good better than their representatives. What populists mean by the people and what Publius and Brownson meant by it is different. Madison, Hamilton, and Brownson were advocates of natural aristocracy, a concept at odds with the underlying assumptions of populism. By the people, they did not mean a momentary, undifferentiated mass of individuals. They had in mind an organic community of individuals who were embedded in territorial communities that were animated by cultures imbued with philosophical realism. In Federalist 15, Hamilton expresses a similar understanding of human nature and government as that expressed by Madison in Federalist 51 when he asks, "Why has government been instituted at all?" He answers, "Because the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint." Once again, the point is clear. Human beings need to be governed because of their imperfect and fallen nature. Hamilton reinforces Madison's argument that government as well as the people need to be checked and restrained. Hamilton explains that in the nature of sovereign power, that there is in the nature of sovereign power an impatience of control that creates a disposition in political leaders to look with an evil eye upon all external attempts to restrain and direct its operations. The love of power makes conformity to the common good difficult. To what does Hamilton attribute these tendencies of human beings to behave in opposition to reason, justice, and the common good? In his words, the Constitution of Man. From this brief description of the American framers' view of human nature and politics, it is no wonder that Brownson embraced the American constitutional tradition. Once Brownson worked through his spiritual journey that included a populist phase and settled into the Catholic faith, he was, like Madison and Hamilton, convinced that human beings were morally dualistic and that politics must account for that reality. Moral dualism meant that humans had to be subject to the constraints of government and law, and that political leaders had to be subject to the restraints of law as well. Yet Brownson was more attentive to the unwritten Constitution than were the American framers. He recognized that institutional restraints and the architecture of government were insufficient by themselves to provide adequate checks on human nature. He argued in the American Republic that paper constitutions were largely powerless to combat harmful cultural forces. One must fight fire with fire. Cultural supports were necessary to make political institutions viable. Political leaders had to be prepared by the culture to serve in office. Like Plato, Brownson was astutely aware that political and social order were dependent on virtue. Brownson's great contribution to American political thought is to consider a central role for Catholic Christianity as the spiritual foundation for the American political order. He stated that without the papacy or the Catholic Church, the Republican or Democratic form of government has nothing to stand on. Arguably, Brownson pushed the point to an extreme. No form of government, not merely the American government, can be just without the Catholic Church, Brownson believed. This is a bold statement to make in the context of 19th century America, an overwhelmingly Protestant nation. It helps to explain the immoderate and imprudent argument that Brownson makes in his essay, Mission of America. Brownson was of like mind with the American framers regarding the role of the people in the political system. He was familiar with the sentiments of Jacksonian Democrats, who espoused the virtue of the common people and favored using popular sentiments as the standard for political decision-making. Such democratic absolutists posit that the voice of the people is the voice of God, an assumption that does not comport with moral dualism or Republican theory. Once this elevation of the popular will occurs, it is to the advantage of demagogues to manufacture public opinion. The problem with the momentary majority, as Brownson and the framers see it, is that it exists outside the institutional framework of the Constitution. As such, the people are, in Brownson's words, quote, simply a mob or disorderly mass without law and without authority. Rule by the momentary majority is pure, not constitutional democracy, a distinction made by Brownson in Constitutional Guarantees and Madison in Federalist 10. Brownson's essay, The Democratic Principle, was one of the first anti-populist writings by an American. There he explains in great detail a point he first made in the Church and the Republic. Politics is subordinate to religion. All political authority, including the people in a democracy, is subordinate to religious authority. The will of the people cannot be the supreme authority because it is morally imperfect and thus in need of governing. Human will is governed by both the church and the state. Brownson rejects the notion that popular consent legitimizes government. The people and their governments must obey a higher law than statutory or even constitutional law. Brownson states that laws emanate from the people, or that are laws that emanate from the people, or that are binding only by virtue of the assent of the governed, or that emanate from any human source alone, have none of the essential characteristics of law. Why? Because they bind no conscience and restrain, except by force, no will. Human will must be ordered and inspired by God before political laws and institutions can promote justice. In a different context, Walter Lippmann echoed Brownson's point in a way that illuminates the connection between the written and unwritten constitutions. Lippmann uses the language of higher law rather than unwritten constitution. And Lippmann writes, constitutional restraints and bills of rights, the whole apparatus of responsible government and of an independent judiciary, the conception of due process of law in courts, in legislatures, among executives, are but the rough approximations by which men have sought to exercise the devil of arbitrariness in human relations. Among a people which does not try to obey this higher law, higher unwritten law, no constitution is worth the paper it is written on. Though they have all the forms of liberty, they will not enjoy its substance. The laws depend upon moral commitments which could never possibly be expressly stated in the laws themselves, upon a level of truthfulness in giving testimony, of reasonableness in argument, of trust, confidence, and good faith in transactions, upon a mood of disinterestedness and justice far above anything that the letter of the law demands. Brownson and Lippmann articulate a neglected source of political and social order, the unwritten Constitution. One of Brownson's last essays is Constitutional Guarantees. At the end of that essay, he crystallizes his view on the unwritten Constitution by stating that, quote, "We ask no constitutional change in the political order of our country," by which he means no constitutional amendments. However, he adds, "We do ask for a change in the people, a change to be effected by the Catholic missionary and the conversion to the Catholic faith, in which is our only hope for our country, as well as for the salvation of the souls of our countrymen." While Brownson at times opposed or supported changes to American policy or institutional design, his emphasis was on culture and character rather than conventional structures. Politics was downstream from culture. In his view, the best hope for American democracy was a people whose intelligence and conscience were informed by the Catholic faith. He feared that without the cultural influence of the Church, democracy would fail. It would be little more than majority tyranny. He held this point in common with Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote in Democracy in America that the reign of liberty cannot be established without morality, nor morality without beliefs, by which he means religious faith. Brownson is acutely aware that the forms of government require spiritual support for their efficacy. Justice, for example, is not merely a political end. It is ultimately rooted in divine authority. Consequently, politics must be informed by individuals who are inspired by more than utility, power, or interest. Democracy requires moral leadership. The common good is the product of attunement to divine authority. Protestant Christianity is deficient in this regard because it transfers authority from the church to the individual. It undermines the reliance of the individual on the church and takes to an extreme the ability of individuals to comply unaided with God's will in the moral anarchy of the soul. A Protestant culture was susceptible to populism because both Protestantism and populism undermine the higher authority, or one might say leadership, on which democracy depends. Like Protestantism, populism delegitimizes hierarchy and leadership. It treats the raw popular will as the supreme authority, as Protestantism, or at least some variants of Protestantism, treat the individual as the authority. Conflating democratic sentiments or will with justice and the good is a mere variation on Thrasymachus's view of justice in the Republic. Brownson was astute in following the Western tradition's rejection of Thrasymachus's sophistry and its application to the democratic age. Just as a ruler's will is not the measure of justice, so too the people's will is not the measure of justice. Brownson sides in this debate with a long line of thinkers, including Cicero and Aquinas, who identified political and moral authority in a transcendent source, natural law. For democracy to thrive in America, Brownson believed that American culture would have to maintain a living political and religious tradition that synthesized republicanism and Catholicism. That synthesis avoids the immoderate extremes of populism and integralism, both of which are revolutionary when compared to Brownson's defense of the American Republic. The question has changed, however, since Brownson's day. It is no longer a question of the compatibility of American democracy and Catholic Christianity. It is rather a question of the compatibility of American culture and American constitutionalism. The rise of naturalistic ideology has so altered the American culture, including Catholic culture, that the viability of American constitutionalism is at risk. If Brownson was correct, then the only remedy for such political and social ills is found in the life of the soul enriched by a Christian faith and leadership that is focused on character and not social justice. A starting point for the recovery of the American constitutional order and its underlying culture would be Catholic clergy who are more interested in eradicating sin in the human heart than in inspiring social and political change. Thank you.
Well, I just wanted to say it's a great honor to be on the same panel as Michael, who's edited a collection of Brownson essays. My remarks are mostly derived in addition to the American Republic, and also very grateful to be joined by two young Raven alumni from Benedictine College, one of whom was in the very first class that I got to teach Brownson 4 years ago, and sitting next to him, Jane Whalen, is finishing up her master's here at American and coming back to go direct a new museum space for us with a replica of Independence Hall, where the Center for Constitutional Liberty is going to move. And also very grateful to Tom for the opportunity to think through the kind of practical applications of some of Brownson's writings, which I realized I probably should have done before taking him into a classroom. But this is a great opportunity for that as well. But I wanted to start with two possible temptations that face American Catholics. One is the pressure that we might have, or that we might face, maybe not us in the room, but certainly people we know, to uncritically adopt aspects of philosophic liberalism that probably lurked somewhere in the brains of some of our founding fathers. On the other hand, we might be tempted to withdraw from political life, or even worse, to distrust our political regime, to treat it as something foreign to our Catholic faith, or to our Christian faith, or even hostile. And Brownson rejects both of those approaches. So Brownson insists that we're not bound to the speculative theories of some particular founders, but rather that we're bound to loyalty to the things that they did, to the thing done. That is, we're bound to the political order that actually exists, not to abstract theories that may or may not correspond to political reality. We don't need to accept Locke's liberalism to love the country that our founders built, according to Brownson. And because of that freedom that we have to love what our founders did without loving everything that was in the thought processes of Thomas Jefferson, Brownson says that Catholics should, quote, place a generous confidence in the government and love and cherish it as their own. So Brownson criticizes Catholics in his day who separated themselves in their feelings, separated themselves from the nation in their feelings about America, or who looked upon our government, our country, as an enemy that should be distrusted. Instead, he insisted that we, speaking to Catholics in America, we are as responsible for the doings of our regime as any other class of citizens. So this means that Catholic laymen are not outsiders. They're not a tolerated minority standing at a distance. And Catholic laymen in America shouldn't view themselves that way. We're citizens just like every other citizen, and therefore we have to take responsibility for the public affairs of our political community. And that has several practical implications. Brownson expected Catholic laymen to take their place as free and equal citizens with American interests and American sympathies. And that included a willingness to cooperate with others in public life, including, of course, in our country, many non-Catholics with whom we live. Brownson also counseled American Catholics to foster an attitude of thanksgiving toward their country. And he lists off a number of things that we can all be thankful for. The United States, he observed, has never martyred a Catholic, in a bloody way at least. It has always allowed the public celebration of Mass, at least with the exception of, never mind. It has welcomed Catholic immigrants. It's recognized their civil equality. And in that context, Brownson also suggests that ingratitude toward the country is a kind of sin. It's really impious. Brownson also mentions that we should be especially grateful that we've never made war on the Pope. And I hope that will still ring true a week from today. So we can be very grateful. So we have to foster gratitude. We have to love our country. We have to work for our nation's true interests, not merely what the majority happens to want. And he says American Catholics should pray for the conversion of their country. In order to be dutiful citizens, we also have to accept that we, American Catholics, from Brownson's essays, are in fact Americans. We're not Europeans. We're not subjects of some earlier political form, and we're not inhabitants of some lost world. There can be a temptation that he noticed even in the 19th century among serious Catholics to imagine that the ideal political life must look like something totally other than what they were experiencing in America. Perhaps the states of early modern Europe or the grandeur of a more unified Christian civilization. But Brownson makes it very clear that that is not the situation that American Catholics faced in the 19th century. They weren't, and we aren't, broke French Catholics under a Catholic monarch with a concordat with the Pope who gets to appoint, who gets to nominate certain bishops. We are citizens of an American republic. And so Brownson insisted that we had to love the country we actually have and to influence the people who actually lived around us and try to improve the institutions that actually govern us. And if we were to do otherwise, it would be an unjust form of escapism. Brownson actually mocked Catholics who couldn't bend their minds to consider the actual political situation on the ground in the United States in the mid-19th century. They instead seemed to long for a different kind of regime and a very different kind of culture. And as Brownson suggests, Catholics had to get, he called them these grooves in these well-worn grooves in their mind that they simply had to break out of to accept the situation they were actually in and take responsibility for the political order in which they actually lived. So if we're responsible for this order and called to love it as our own, what does it actually depend on? Because for Brownson, the American system is not self-sustaining. It depends on a moral and religious order that it does not itself produce. Brownson describes our community as consisting of three elements. The state, represented by authority, the individual, represented by liberty, and the church or religion. And he's very blunt about the consequences of the prospects of losing religion. He does not think the republic can sustain itself. And he argues more specifically that without the Catholic Church, we can't have religion in the sense that's required to sustain a political order or a decent political order. Why is that? He argues that the church is necessary because it's a real and independent power in society, and without the Catholic Church, one of two things would happen. Either an individual claims ultimate authority, which he thinks would lead toward fragmentation and anarchy, or the state would claim ultimate authority, and he suggests that maybe these two things are linked, which will lead toward centralization and despotism. And the church prevents both. It stands as an authority that's not reducible to private judgment, nor absorbable into political power. And he says that the auxiliary supports in our Constitution, like its institutional structure, the separation of powers, even his beloved pre-14th Amendment federalism, are not enough on their own. The system requires a deeper moral and religious foundation. So why did that foundation fail to operate in the mid-19th century in his view? Because he critiques the religious situation of his time. He says that he who denies that his religion should govern his politics, as well as all his actions, virtually denies morality, denies the divine law, and asserts political atheism. So religion for Brownson must not be subjected to politics. It is politics for Brownson that must be governed by religion. And to deny that is to deny the primacy of the spiritual order. So when it comes to America's Protestant origins, Brownson argues that the American political order is only accidentally Protestant. Its deeper foundations lie in natural law, natural justice, and equity that were all taught and fostered in the intellectual tradition of the Catholic Church from long before the Protestant Reformation. And that it's Catholic citizens who have maintained the resources to continue to defend those ideas, and a kind of optimism about the possibility of the human mind to have access to forms and to be able to deliberate for the common good in public life. But Protestantism, moreover, in addition to no longer sort of being, in his day at least, being a muscular defender of natural law, when he encountered it, it tended toward two unstable forms, either collapsing into private judgment, becoming more and more individualized, or, as I said, becoming an instrument of state political power. And in neither case can it function in the way that he thinks religion has to function in order to maintain the freedom of the individual and also the coherence of the state to govern for the common good. And that is that a religion that's strong enough basically to be authoritative for both. So if religion is subsumed by the state, it can't fulfill that role. And if it is subsumed by individuals, it just collapses into the same anarchy as individuals. So there's fragmentation. There's no authority strong enough to prevent schism. Brownson points to divisions over slavery in his day, divisions over the morality of temperance laws and of alcohol, and even the morality of divorce, which was a special concern of his after the Civil War. That in many Protestant traditions, marriage is reduced to a civil contract that could be open, at least in principle, to serial marriage, which Brownson regarded as being a serious problem for the stability of the family. More broadly, reliance on private judgment in matters of religion, according to Brownson, might lead some to the conclusion that there is no rational ground to prefer one religious claim over another. So in order to preserve unity, politics is elevated above religion, and religion is gradually emptied of dogmatic content. So something else inevitably takes its place. And that the result of all this is what he calls a political atheism. Basically the denial that God's law governs political and social life. So how can the primacy of the spiritual be maintained in our political order, according to Brownson? Starts with lay responsibility. So he says, everything depends on ourselves, he says, speaking to American lay Catholics. Laymen must not withdraw, must not distrust, must not blame our country or its institutions. Brownson's particularly critical of those who attribute their difficulties to hostile influences, rather to their own ignorance about our political forms or their own laziness. We have to act. We can't just fold our hands and wait around for someone else to make our political situation better. In particular, he's not suggesting that we wait for clergymen to come direct us in political affairs. As many other speakers have mentioned, he thought that it was an abnormal situation for clergy to be serving in temporal roles in civil society. Now, he granted the church teaches authoritatively in matters of faith and morals. The laity should be docile to that teaching, even when those spiritual matters indirectly relate to temporal affairs, as Bracy mentioned in the last panel. But within that framework, laymen themselves must act. So laymen have to exercise prudence and take initiative. So the danger he saw was a kind of quietism, the kind of Benedict option, possibly. But in a republic like ours, that kind of quietism is not a defensible option for Brownson. We share in political rule, and therefore we have to share in the responsibility for the common good. And so in America, that means that laymen have to embrace certain features of the national character in order to be listened to, in order to have an effect. And he points in particular to energy, industriousness, and self-reliance as kind of core aspects of the American political character. Those are not defects that we have to root out. Those are things that he thinks American Catholics should embrace. Now, he acknowledges that Europeans might look down on some of that, look down on the kind of busy Americans who are always doing stuff. But in America, Catholics simply have to become excellent Americans, not by abandoning our faith, but by allowing their faith to perfect what is best in the American character. So in the Pauline sense, we're to be Greeks to the Greeks and Jews to the Jews, and in this case, Americans to the Americans. But it's not merely activism and energy and activity. So some might say, okay, that sounds not very spiritual. How can you vindicate the primacy of the spiritual through this kind of activity? Brownson defends this notion by pointing to other decent trades and occupations. He says we look at labor, trade, law, medicine. He says all of those may be converted into prayer if they're done for the love of God. So Brownson's not saying that activity, political activity even, replaces prayer. He's saying that activity must be transformed by prayer. And the danger in a society as energetic and productive as our own isn't simply that we miss out on prayer, as bad as that is. It's that our activity becomes oriented toward the wrong end. Without a contemplative foundation, work and activity in political life could easily become a matter of control, of efficiency, of the conquest of nature, or self-assertion. But prayer can interrupt that tendency, reminding us that our activity is not oriented toward our domination of nature, but to the love of God. And that our work is not ordered only to production or success, but to higher spiritual goods instead. And it could remind us that the world's not raw material for our domination, but part of an order that we receive gratefully and participate in. And so our prayer doesn't pull us away from action, it reorders and reorients it, and ensures that even the most active life remains directed toward God, rather than toward the merely temporal ends that can so easily take over. And so within the rough and tumble of American life, Brownson insists on the primacy of the contemplative, the primacy of the spiritual, the importance of personal holiness, having a robust faith and a robust piety. I'll stop there.
As you were ending, Kevin, I saw some parallels with what Rick Santorum was talking about after lunch of retaking the culture, and that Catholics can play a big role in that. But it's not just Catholics. It has to be a Catholic who is rooted in his faith. I'm recalling something that he wrote during his conversion process, where he was talking about he's wrestling with the idea of permanence and change, and the things that are permanent. How do you reconcile that with the change in the world? And he looked at Jesus. He wrote this essay on the mediatorial role of Jesus, mission of Jesus, where he combines the permanence of the spiritual authority with his humanity and the change going on in the world. And at that point, he didn't really believe that Jesus was true God and true man. As he comes into the Catholic Church, he sees Jesus more and more, as a Catholic, as true God and true man, with that same combination of permanence and change. And he actually talks about Jesus working. Can you comment more about that role of the individual layperson working in the middle of the world, not imitating, but taking that role of Jesus with the permanent and incorporating the permanent with the change, which could be expressed in family or work?
Yeah, two anecdotes that came to mind as you were saying that from Brownson's writings. One is that even for the maybe not totally politically active sort of citizen, he references a servant girl. Mentions that even the prayers of this servant girl, saying her Ave Marias, might even be more effective than his work as a journalist in terms of making this country a better place. But in terms of the specific character of the person working in political life in the middle of the world with this contemplative spirit, he mentions in the context of his dissatisfaction or his worries, let's say, about the stability of the kind of Protestant culture, that he points out that he says there's lots of people of goodwill out there who are looking for examples of human beings who seem to be able to approach their work and life with peace and with a spirit of gratitude and with diligence and responsibility and with the kind of subjection to rightful and reasonable authority. And Brownson thought that could be exemplified by the kind of Catholic lay activity that he was discussing. And so it seemed like he thought there was also not just a lot of intrinsic benefit to that, but that laymen following his call would help be great examples to their fellow countrymen who are really hungry for something that could stand apart from the state and the individual, and that this kind of life could be really impressive to them.
This is kind of following up on the question you just answered, but something that I've seen, especially like in the last year, about like from some of my current classmates, is almost like an idea of like withdrawing, but they still they want to win, like in America and whatnot, in like politics, but they'd rather in some ways, I guess, like let everything fall apart, but they can still be smug in the sense that well, I told you guys this was going to happen, and I really stuck to my principles, and I was never willing to cooperate with anyone. And I guess, and that's kind of convoluted, but how do you think we can go to those people and be like, hey, we have to, even though it's not all the way right now, we're stepping in the right direction? And if that doesn't make sense, I can try to clean it up.
I think well, I'll just make a couple of brief comments. One is to keep in mind what Senator Santorum said earlier today, and that is that in your personal life, of course, you have opportunities apart from whatever may be going on out in the larger culture to live the good life, to live it according to justice, to live it according to God's will. You do most of your work in family. You live most of your life in family. And so that has a ripple effect, of course, on the culture. And I think we can become overwhelmed at times when we focus too much on things that are very external and that are out of our control. It's not that they're not important, but I worry when college students, and I've spent 37 years teaching them, think too much about the outside world and don't think enough about themselves. So I'll give you an example that hopefully engenders a chuckle. But if you think you can fix the world, but you can't get to class on time, you have things a little backwards there, right? So work on yourself first. And my parting comment in my presentation about members of the clergy who are more interested in curing sin and addressing sin than they are in social justice and fixing society and politics That's part of the problem. And that's what engenders in part this thinking that we're born to fix the world, that our faith is about fixing the world. There may be some of that in our faith, but the crime that the social justice movement has done to us, including within the church, is distract our attention from what is primary. And what is primary is fixing ourselves. And if we fix ourselves, I don't mean they can be fixed permanently, but if we make ourselves better human beings, the political and social side of things largely take care of themselves. But what work we have to do in the political and social domain is contingent on doing that existential work first.
Just very briefly, the issue, I mean, one thing I faced, and I'm sure many of your classmates or other people your age have talked about, is there seems to be an interest in being able to kind of publicly proclaim the kind of pure beliefs about X, Y, or Z without as much interest in taking responsibility to actually move things in the right direction. And I mean, I don't know what else to try other than examples of great statesmen that I think might be admirable to people in some way and catch their attention. But I think Brownson at least gives a lot of room to point to things he says that push people toward political prudence.
You're talking about people, friends of yours, who are saying, I'm going to withdraw from public life because it's so bad. I'm not going to talk to people outside. Like,
kind of like what Professor Vance was saying, where it's like just like saying this is like exactly what I believe, and I'll be like involved in society, but I'm not willing to like cooperate in society.
don't talk to other people about their beliefs. See,
Well, they'll tell people who wants to listen to them, but
They won't persuade them.
yeah.
yeah, what about Jesus and the disciples?
Good comment. Yeah, I thank you for that really interesting presentation. Regarding the populism thing, and I kind of understand why people are anti-elite at this moment and kind of just switching from party to party, because if you look what the state we're in, 39 trillion in debt, inflation, and that's why I think we're probably, sadly, I mean, I'm on the right side, we're going to lose the midterms bad because we're just sort of switching back and forth. But I do think like the populist movement, I guess, is the best avenue for Catholics. So I think like Trump has all the right ideas. He's against abortion. He obviously is much more aligned with Catholics than the alternative. And I think it's our responsibility to make sure that we get educated and help kind of provide that natural law basis, or give him the why for why he's doing all the good things he's doing.
I'm not sure I would agree with all of your assumptions that you're making there about Trump's alignment with Catholicism. It starts with character, and he certainly is deficient in a number of regards with character. The fact that his politics may align may be by design, and it may be for other reasons, like political self-interest. But the point about populism is, in part, I get the frustration with the American political elite, and I think there are very good reasons to be critical of the American political elite. I'm not going to defend the American political or cultural elite, but the answer is not to replace the political elite with the momentary popular will. Brownson and the framers are both adamantly opposed to that very idea. The challenge is to build a new elite class or new elite classes, and that has to be done within the culture. But if you undermine the very notion that we need anything like hierarchy in church or in politics and culture, then when you're over the storm, the difficulty becomes now you've taught people that elites are inherently corrupt. And how are you ever going to get them to follow even good leaders if that's what they've come to believe? And of course, the will of the people, as you yourself just described, it ebbs and it flows. You know, that's not the thing to follow if we want to follow the path of justice. That's all based primarily on self-interest.
So on that point, then, just you mentioned Patrick Deneen. If I might, at the risk of being attacked in this room, maybe, if I could just say a word. I mean, in this very room, maybe a few years ago, he gave a talk called Populism, a vision for American politics, or something like that, in which he basically argued that what we need is a kind of a new elite that sort of a combination in the classical model of a sort of mixed regime, a new elite that cares about the populace and is virtuous and is able to sort of lead them in a kind of virtuous way, one that they kind of associate themselves with the populace instead of viewing the populace as the problem, which is sort of what our elites do, which create real populism. So it sounds to me like you and Patrick maybe don't disagree that much, or maybe I'm mishearing, but can you maybe speak to that?
On that point, I don't agree. I mean, I don't disagree with Patrick. Where we disagree is that he wants to abandon the American political tradition in doing that. He has colleagues who talk about burning the Constitution, and no, he does not go that far. But there are others who travel in those circles that do. And Patrick at least disparages the American political tradition as a whole. He can really find no good in it.
I should also express my filial piety to Deneen for getting me interested in Orestes Brownson to begin with.
Yeah.
At this moment,
No.
because he loved Orestes. Yeah,
I don't mean to overstate Patrick's case, but it's difficult to find things in his writing, especially his book on liberalism, Why Liberalism Failed, that is positive about the American political tradition. It's part of the development of liberalism. And I don't think Patrick would agree that there are elements of the American founding that are consistent with classical and Judeo-Christian political theory. And because of that, that's what makes it essentially rotten and something that needs to be replaced, not reformed. So the difference is, if you're going to build this new elite, build it on what? I would say build it on the American political tradition, on the tradition especially of the framers, that's a healthy thing to do, that they had healthy predispositions, they had a healthy philosophical anthropology, that you have to reconstitute that tradition, but still you start with it, in a Burkean way, that's our heritage. So I'm happy to embrace it in the way that Brownson embraced it.
Well, thank you very much. Let's have a hand for